Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely reframe everything you thought you knew about one of history's oldest, most famous stories. If you think Homer's ancient epic is just, some dusty chronicle of Bronze Age battles, well, prepare to have your mind changed. We are using this masterpiece as a deeply relevant psychological mirror, one that reflects our own modern human flaws.
Okay, let's dive into a massive misconception right off the bat. It's so common to hear this epic described as the definitive story of the Trojan War. But, spoiler alert, the famous Trojan horse? Yeah, it's not even in it. It doesn't show the beginning of the war, and it actually doesn't even show the end. It focuses entirely on this relatively short, incredibly intense period near the very tail end of a 10-year siege.
So the true core of this epic really isn't military history at all. It's actually a profound psychological mirror reflecting unchecked human emotion. We're talking about anger, pride, leadership, friendship, grief, and mortality. But more than anything, it's a devastating look at what happens when incredibly powerful people allow their own wounded egos to govern their decisions.
Here is our agenda for today. 1. The true cost of anger. 2. The high price of pride. 3. Duty, glory, and mortality. 4. The illusion of revenge. And finally, empathy and self-mastery.
All right, Section 1, the true cost of anger, when emotion becomes strategy. We've got to begin with the central problem that kicks off this entire disaster, which is the absolute rage of the Greeks' greatest warrior, Achilles.
And this brilliantly illustrates how quickly a completely legitimate feeling of insult spirals into a total catastrophe. So, the Greek commander Agamemnon publicly humiliates Achilles by taking away a captive woman awarded to him. Achilles is furious, right? He absolutely refuses to fight. But this personal dispute ends up costing thousands of lives. Without him, the Greeks face total defeat, which leads Achilles' closest companion, Patroclus, to fight in his place and ultimately die. Achilles' anger then mutates. It turns into this blind, grief-fueled revenge against the Trojan warrior Hector.
Now, the crucial takeaway here for modern leadership is this. There is a massive difference between feeling anger and making anger your actual strategy. Achilles definitely had a legitimate reason to be insulted, but his anger began making the decisions for him. A wounded person often thinks, "I'll show them." But decisions made primarily to punish someone, they frequently end up damaging innocent bystanders who had absolutely nothing to do with the original offense. Before you act, you absolutely must identify the wound of humiliation or rejection underneath that anger.
Moving on to Section 2, the high price of pride, the collapse of negotiation. This is the clash of egos that started it all, a toxic dynamic that destroys modern business partnerships, friendships, and marriages every single day.
What we're looking at here is a masterclass in leadership failure. On one side, Agamemnon has the highest position among the commanders. He has the positional authority, and he flat out refuses to appear weak. On the other side, Achilles is the greatest warrior. He has immense influence, irreplaceable competence, and he refuses disrespect. Neither guy will yield. Agamemnon can command Achilles, sure, but he can't replace him, so Agamemnon might win the initial confrontation by forcing Achilles to submit, but strategically, he loses completely, all because he didn't know when to restrain his own ego.
I really want you to ask yourself, what is my pride costing me? Because as this epic clearly shows, winning the argument might not actually mean winning the situation. In real life, negotiations fail and relationships escalate into war, not because the disagreement was impossible to solve, but simply because neither person wanted to be the first one to compromise.
Which brings us to Section 3, Duty, Glory, and Mortality, Choosing Your Path.
This is such a fascinating contrast between two very different types of ambition. Achilles knows he faces a choice. He can stay away from Troy and live a long, ordinary life, or he can fight, die young, and achieve legendary, everlasting glory. He chooses glory. Hector, on the other hand, doesn't fight for personal fame at all. He fights because Troy is his home. He has a wife, he has a young son. He knows he might die, but he fights out of a profound sense of responsibility. It's the stark difference between wanting to be great versus knowing that something depends on you. And we make smaller versions of Achilles' choice every single day. We are constantly weighing our career against our family, our wealth against our time, achievement against our health, and fame against peace. Now, ambition isn't inherently bad, but this ancient story forces us to stop and ask, is the recognition you're pursuing actually worth the price? Achilles got his glory. Thousands of years later, we are literally still saying his name. But he paid for it with absolutely everything he had.
Let's dive into Section 4, the illusion of revenge, the limits of achievement.
Achilles has everything society associates with greatness: status, strength, immense courage, and fame. But when his closest companion Patroclus is killed, we hit the absolute breaking point of the story.
And this brings us to a harsh, unavoidable emotional reality. You simply cannot outperform bereavement. No amount of worldly success, strength, or achievement can protect you from vulnerability or eliminate grief. Love creates vulnerability because anything you deeply value can be lost. Homer portrays this not as a weakness, but as a fundamental part of being human. Achilles' elite status could not save his friend.
So, Achilles decides he absolutely must kill Hector to answer for Patroclus' death. He achieves his goal, killing Hector and dragging his body in a blind rage. But here is the brutal psychological truth: Patroclus remains dead. Achilles kills Hector believing it's going to heal him, but revenge frequently promises an emotional closure it can never actually deliver. It just punishes the person you blame without repairing what you lost. When you are hurt, you have to ask yourself, do I want justice, restoration, or simply for the other person to hurt too?
Section 5. Empathy and Self-Mastery. Breaking the Cycle. The climax of the epic actually isn't the fall of Troy. In fact, the poem ends before Troy even falls. The true climax is a quiet, devastatingly human moment in a Greek tent.
Hector's elderly father, King Priam, does the unthinkable. He secretly sneaks into the enemy camp, kneels before the man who killed his son, and kisses Achilles' hands. He begs for Hector's body and asks Achilles to think of his own father. And in that moment, something extraordinary happens. Achilles no longer sees an enemy king, he just sees a grieving father. Achilles thinks of his own father, who will eventually lose him too, and these two bitter enemies cry together. Empathy begins when our rigid identities disappear, and we finally recognize our own humanity in someone else.
This masterpiece ultimately sets the stage for its companion epic, the Odyssey. And there's a really beautiful progression here. We move from the destructive anger, pride, and raw physical strength of Achilles to the endurance, adaptability, and intelligence required by Odysseus to survive. The Iliad asks, what is worth dying for? While the Odyssey asks, what is worth living for? But to even reach that second question, Achilles first had to learn how to see humanity in his sworn enemy. It is so incredibly easy to read this epic as just a celebration of heroic warriors. But think about it. The strongest man in the story couldn't control his anger. The most powerful commander couldn't control his ego. And the greatest victory could not resurrect a lost friend. Mastering the world is not the same as mastering yourself. Achilles could defeat anyone on the battlefield, but his true struggle, and ours by the way, is learning to defeat the rage inside. So if you spend your whole life conquering your industry, your competitors, and your goals, but you cannot conquer your own ego, who is really in charge of your life?